So far we've built like a nice little Node.js application. It's been running on Debian, which is a perfectly valid and perfectly great operating system. There's lots of reasons that you would run something inside of Debian. But there's an issue with the fact that like Debian is quite large. Like this node package, I think it ends up being like almost a gigabyte, something like that. It's quite large, right? It's a whole operating system, basically, like at least the file structure for it. So it'd be great if we could make something smaller, right? So I want to introduce you to something called Alpine Linux. It's something that we've actually kind of already accidentally been using because a lot of things are built on Alpine Linux. But let's go ahead and just have a little chat about it. So Alpine Linux is like the most bare bones, smallest distribution of Linux that it can possibly be. It includes just the tools that it thinks that you're going to need to run your application and literally nothing else. Everything else you have to put in yourself, right? The advantage of this is you go from like 900 megabytes to 5. So Alpine's base layer is 5 megabytes. And actually, just so you know, Alpine is actually based on another distribution of Linux called BusyBox. And BusyBox, I believe, came out of Samsung. You might want to look me up on that one. But BusyBox is 2 megabytes, and it's even like more bare bones. I would suggest just going with Alpine. Those extra 3 megabytes are almost all things that you would need anyway, so you'd end up reinstalling that stuff anyway. The trade-off here with Alpine Linux is that it just requires a lot more work to get stuff working, right? Like it doesn't even include like certificate authorities. It doesn't include like a bunch of stuff that you would likely need. But the good news is it includes nothing that you don't need. And a great example of this is like if you include Debian, on Debian by default is Python. It's a great language. We did not use Python at all in our application. So there's actually a security vulnerability. So if someone can get onto our server and download a Python file, they can execute it right away with a Python interpreter that's on the server, right? But if there's no Python interpreter, they'd have to find a way to install it, and that's a lot more difficult than just connecting to a server. So that's why Alpine Linux is secure. It's secure by just having less stuff on it, right? You just like eliminate a whole class of security vulnerabilities that you'll have. The other thing is like things that download a lot quicker. They're cheaper to store. They're cheaper to run. I don't necessarily think that that's the biggest part of this. Maybe the pricing, right? It's because I know things like Azure Container Registry, which is a private registry for containers, does charge by size. So you'll save yourself a little bit of money in that respect, but it's not much, right? So that's like a nice side effect. The security part is actually what I think is the compelling reason to use a smaller version of Linux. So how hard is it to switch your project from Stretch to Alpine? Well, let's go give it a shot. So what I'm going to do, because I'm lazy and I don't want to restart my entire project, is I'm going to say copy -r everything in. Actually, I'm going to cd out of this, and I'm going to say copy -r, more complicated that, and I'm going to put that into a directory called Alpine Linux. So now I have another directory called Alpine Linux, and I just copied everything over there. I'm doing this so hopefully you can go back and like reference what you built later. So inside of here, as you may imagine, everything's literally the same. But I want to change this from a Debian project to a Alpine project. And there's a bit of witchcraft that you have to do. You have to change the word stretch to Alpine. That's it. That's all you have to do. So now if we go back in here and say, am I in the right directory? I'm not. I have to go into Alpine Linux. And we're going to run build again. And again, you could put different tags on all of these if you wanted to. But I'm not going to. So you can see there's a couple more layers. I think the node one, once you add node into it, ends up being about 20 megabytes, right? Because there's some tools that come around with like node and npm and all that kind of stuff. Plus, you're going to include a bunch of node modules. Those take up space as well. I think all said and done, I measured this earlier, and I believe this container that we just built, I believe, is 80 megabytes, as opposed to 913, I think is what I measured the other one. So yeah, 913 to 86. And if we just go to Docker, inspect my app, somewhere in here it will tell you how big it is. Size, right there. So you'd have to go in and calculate how many bytes that translates into. According to my documentation here, that's 86 megabytes. All right, so now if we go ahead and try and run this again, right there, right there, right there. Works just fine, but instead of using Debian, we're now on to Alpine, but we just saved ourselves an entire class of bugs by including much less. Now there is a Debian distribution called Debian Slim. So if I went 12-stretch-slim, I think you go down to about 150 megabytes, but you still get full Debian. So that's a possibility as well. I know lots of people do that. Ubuntu used to do that as well, that there was like Ubuntu Slim, and now actually there is no full Ubuntu, it's just Ubuntu Slim, and everything else you have to build yourself. There might be a full one somewhere, but I don't know how to get it, because it doesn't matter. So pretty good. Yeah, node latest, last time I checked, was 908 megabytes. Whereas node 12 Alpine is about 80. It's a pretty stark difference. So this is kind of where I wanted to talk a little bit about distributions of Linux. One, I'm not a Linux master by any stretch of the imagination. When I use Linux, I use Ubuntu just because that's the one I know. That's one I've always used. By some proxy, I know a bit about Debian because Ubuntu is based on Debian, right? So my default is I use Ubuntu or Debian for anything that I'm doing locally. It has all the tools I know how to use. And then anytime that I'm sending stuff out to production, I try and get it on Alpine because then it's smaller, right, and more secure. But you can totally do things with RHEL, like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's another great distribution of Linux. Mint, SUSE, Kali, they're all good distributions of Linux. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention about Alpine. So it doesn't even include Bash. That's probably the hardest part about this for me, is that I have to do -it. There's a bunch of stuff that it's using something called ASH, A-S-H, instead of Bash, which is a minimalistic shell and not a full born-again shell, which is what Bash is, right? So there are differences, and I don't know them, right? So that, for me, is one of the reasons that I don't use Alpine all the time, is because I don't know ASH very well. That was the last thing I wanted to mention.